11,000 feet above Luzon, a single P-51D Mustang bore down on 13 Japanese aircraft. The Packard Merlin screamed at full military power. Airspeed climbed past 350 miles per hour. Ammunition counters showed 1,800 rounds remaining across 6 guns. The odds were simple arithmetic. 1 American fighter, 1 wingman somewhere behind, 12 enemy fighters and a twin-engine bomber ahead. The mathematics of survival had already failed. The morning of January 11, 1945, carried the weight of routine over Luzon's northern mountains. Fog clung to the valleys below, white and thick, pooling between ridgelines like cotton pressed into the creases of the earth. Above the weather, the sky opened into that particular shade of Pacific blue that combat pilots learned to distrust. Clear air meant visibility. Visibility meant being seen. Major William A. Shomo had departed Lingayen Airfield shortly after dawn, leading a 2-ship reconnaissance patrol into territory the 5th Air Force had marked as contested. His wingman, Lieutenant Paul Lipscomb, flew a loose combat spread perhaps 300 yards to his right and slightly behind. 2 aircraft, no fighter escort, no bomber formation to protect, just eyes over enemy-held ground. The mission was observation. The standing orders were explicit. Reconnaissance pilots were to locate, identify, and report. Engagement was authorized only in self-defense or against targets of opportunity that posed minimal risk. A lone P-51 possessed neither the ammunition depth nor the tactical support to wage sustained combat against organized resistance. Shomo understood these parameters. He had flown enough missions to know that the men who survived this war were the ones who recognized the difference between opportunity and trap. At approximately 0840 local time, his scan pattern caught movement against the mountain backdrop to the north. The formation emerged from a valley mouth like a procession, climbing slowly toward cruising altitude. The silhouettes resolved in sequence. A twin-engine aircraft at the center, its distinctive greenhouse nose and twin rudders marking it as a Mitsubishi Ki-57 transport, or possibly a Ki-21 bomber pressed into VIP service. Arranged around it in a protective screen flew 11 single-engine fighters, their fixed landing gear and radial engine cowlings identifying them as Ki-43 Hayabusas, the aircraft American pilots called Oscars. 1 additional fighter flew close escort directly alongside the transport. 12 fighters, 1 high-value transport, 13 aircraft total. Shomo's fuel state showed adequate reserves for the planned mission profile, but combat maneuvering consumed fuel at 3 to 4 times the cruise rate. His ammunition load was full, 1,800 rounds of .50 caliber distributed across 6 wing-mounted M2 Browning machine guns. His aircraft carried no bombs, no rockets, just bullets and fuel and the Packard-built Merlin engine turning at 2,800 revolutions per minute. The Japanese formation had not yet detected the 2 American fighters. They flew in a loose defensive arrangement, the transport at center, the escorts layered above and below in a pattern designed more for visibility than for rapid response. Their altitude was slightly below Shomo's, perhaps 1,000 feet beneath his current position. This was the moment where Doctrine became personal. The reconnaissance mission had already succeeded. The patrol had located a significant enemy formation operating in daylight over contested airspace. The appropriate action was to mark the position, note the heading, and radio the contact report back to Lingayen for potential interception by a properly sized fighter element. 2 P-51s against 13 aircraft was not a proper response, but Doctrine also recognized something that the tables and charts could not fully capture. The P-51D possessed advantages that transcended numerical inferiority. It was faster than the Ki-43 at nearly every altitude. Its dive performance exceeded anything the Japanese fighter could match. Its 650 caliber guns threw more weight of fire than the twin machine guns or single 20mm cannon that armed the Oscar. And there was one advantage that mattered more than any performance figure. The Japanese formation was unaware. Surprise, in aerial combat, functioned as a force multiplier with no theoretical ceiling. A fighter pilot who achieved complete surprise against an enemy formation could engage, inflict damage, and disengage before coordinated defense became possible. The first pass was essentially free. The question was whether a single pass could justify the risk of what came after. Shomo's thumb moved to the gun switch. If you want more such stories, like and subscribe so these lives aren't forgotten. William Arthur Shomo was not the kind of pilot who attracted attention before he climbed into a cockpit. Born in Jeannette, Pennsylvania in 1918, he carried the unassuming manner of the industrial towns that lined the Allegheny foothills. His father worked. His mother kept house. The family attended church and followed the pirates and understood that ambition, in that time and place, meant steady work and a house that stayed warm in winter. Flying was not part of the expected trajectory, but something in Shomo responded to the idea of altitude, of mechanical precision, of problems that could be solved through calculation and nerve. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941 before Pearl Harbor transformed aviation from peacetime hobby into industrial necessity. His aptitude tests showed strong spatial reasoning, steady nerves under simulated stress, and an unusual capacity for what the evaluators called procedural retention, the ability to internalize complex sequences until they became automatic. He was not fast. He was not flashy. Instructors noted that he flew precisely, without the dramatic inputs that marked pilots who trusted instinct over training. His gunnery scores were above average but not exceptional. His formation flying was tight, predictable, reliable. In the training pipeline that processed thousands of young Americans into combat aviators, these qualities did not stand out. The pilots who attracted notice were the ones who broke rules and succeeded anyway, the natural sticks who could throw an aircraft through maneuvers that seemed to violate physics and emerge grinning. Shomo was not that pilot. He was the pilot who returned from every training flight with full paperwork and functioning equipment. His assignment to the Pacific Theater came in 1944, after the long months of preparation that transformed aviation cadets into something approaching combat readiness. He joined the 82nd Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, a unit that operated on the margins of the great air campaigns, flying observation missions, photographing enemy positions, gathering the intelligence that shaped operations planned by men who would never see the aircraft they directed. Reconnaissance work suited Shomo's temperament. The mission profile demanded patience, precision, and the discipline to resist engagement when engagement served no purpose. A reconnaissance pilot who scattered his ammunition on targets of opportunity was a reconnaissance pilot who could not complete his assigned task. The cameras mattered more than the guns. The information mattered more than the kills. By January 1945, Shomo had accumulated a modest combat record. He had destroyed a handful of enemy aircraft in encounters that records described as incidental, self-defense engagements during missions that had other primary objectives. He was not an ace. He had no reputation beyond his unit. The 5th Air Force knew him, if it knew him at all, as a steady performer who brought back good photographs. His aircraft, a P-51D Mustang marked with the squadron codes of the 82nd, was one of thousands that flowed into the Pacific Theater as American industrial production reached its wartime peak. The P-51 was not originally a Pacific fighter. Its design had emerged from British requirements and American engineering to create an aircraft optimized for the long escort missions over Europe. But the same qualities that made it effective against the Luftwaffe transferred readily to Pacific conditions: range, speed, altitude performance, firepower. The Mustang could go where other American fighters could not, stay longer, fight harder, and return. Its Packard Merlin engine, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce unit that powered Spitfires, delivered over 1,400 horsepower at altitude and remained reliable across the temperature extremes of Pacific operations. Shomo knew his aircraft intimately. He knew the particular vibration that signaled the Merlin, reaching optimal temperature. He knew the sight picture that meant proper trim, the control pressures that indicated airspeed without needing to scan the instruments. He knew how the aircraft handled at the edge of its performance envelope, not from dramatic testing, but from the accumulated experience of hundreds of hours in the same type. This knowledge was not wisdom in any philosophical sense. It was something simpler and more useful. It was familiarity deep enough that the machine became an extension of intent. On the morning of January 11th, Shomo carried no special premonition. His mission was reconnaissance. His orders were observation. His expectation was a flight through contested airspace, a survey of enemy positions, and a return to Lingayen with photographs that would help planners understand what the Japanese were doing in the mountains of northern Luzon. The encounter that followed would transform his military record and earn him the highest decoration his nation could bestow. But in the cockpit, approaching that formation of 13 aircraft, none of that future existed. There was only the present, the aircraft, the enemy, the choice. The missions before January 11th had taught Shomo how to survive in contested airspace. His flight log from late 1944 recorded the pattern. Long reconnaissance sweeps over Luzon and surrounding islands, photographic runs that traced enemy supply lines and defensive positions, occasional encounters with Japanese fighters that required evasion more often than engagement. The 82nd Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron operated without the protective umbrella that shielded bomber crews and fighter escorts in the major air campaigns. Their missions were small unit actions, flights of 2 or 4 aircraft threading through airspace where detection meant immediate peril and help was measured in hours rather than minutes. Shomo's survival methodology was not heroic. It was procedural. He flew high when conditions permitted, using the P-51's altitude performance to remain above the effective ceiling of ground-based anti-aircraft weapons and beyond the easy reach of climbing Japanese fighters. He maintained strict radio discipline, understanding that transmissions could be intercepted and positions triangulated. He planned his routes to use terrain masking, valleys and ridge lines that blocked line-of-sight observation from known enemy positions. When engagement became unavoidable, he fought defensively. The encounters recorded in his log showed a pattern of brief contacts, initial passes that exploited surprise, immediate disengagement when superiority was lost, rapid egress toward friendly airspace using the Mustang's speed advantage. He claimed kills, but he did not pursue kills. The difference was critical. A fighter pilot who pursued kills stayed in the combat zone. He maneuvered for position, extended engagements, accepted the risks of depleted ammunition and fuel in exchange for confirmed destruction. This approach worked for pilots with escort support, numerical advantage, or exceptional individual skill. It did not work for reconnaissance pilots operating alone in enemy-controlled airspace. Shomo's approach was simpler. He took what the tactical situation offered and departed before the situation could change. This was not timidity. It was calculation. The P-51's performance figures told a story that shaped rational decision-making. At sea level, the Mustang could achieve approximately 440 miles per hour in level flight, faster than any Japanese fighter in regular service. At altitude, the advantage increased. The Merlin engine's supercharger maintained power above 20,000 feet, where Japanese aircraft began to suffer from reduced oxygen flow to their carburetors. In a dive, the disparity became decisive. The P-51's laminar flow wing generated less drag at high speeds than conventional designs. Its structural limits permitted dive speeds that Japanese aircraft could not match without risking control surface failure or structural collapse. A Mustang pilot who needed to disengage could push the nose down, build speed, and simply outrun pursuit. Shomo had used this capability repeatedly. His missions showed the pattern: contact, initial engagement, assessment, disengagement when odds turned unfavorable, return with photographs intact, aircraft functional, pilot alive. The arithmetic was not complicated. A reconnaissance pilot who died in combat produced no more intelligence for his commanders. A reconnaissance pilot who survived produced intelligence indefinitely. The calculation favored survival, but the calculation assumed normal circumstances. It assumed that combat encounters would involve manageable numbers of enemy aircraft, pairs, flights, small formations that could be evaded or briefly engaged. It assumed that friendly airspace was reachable within the fuel and ammunition constraints of the mission. It assumed that the pilot would face the kind of tactical problems that training and doctrine had prepared him to solve. January 11, 1945, offered none of these assumptions. 13 aircraft was not a manageable number. The transport at the center of the formation suggested high-value cargo, possibly staff officers, possibly critical supplies, possibly something important enough to justify the heavy escort that surrounded it. The Japanese formation's course indicated a destination somewhere in northern Luzon, where organized resistance still contested American ground operations. Letting this formation proceed unmolested meant letting the enemy accomplish whatever mission they had undertaken. Engaging meant violating every survival principle that had kept Shomo alive. His wingman, Lieutenant Lipscomb, flew 300 yards to his right. 2 aircraft, 3,600 rounds of ammunition between them. 2 pilots against a formation that outnumbered them more than 6 to 1. The mathematical outcome should have been obvious, but mathematics did not account for the one variable that mattered most in aerial combat. The Japanese formation still did not know the Americans were there. The point of no return came not as a decision, but as a series of actions that made return impossible. Shomo's throttle advanced to full military power. The Merlin's note changed, deeper, more urgent, the sound of 1,400 horsepower compressing into forward motion. The P-51's nose dropped slightly as he converted altitude into speed, trading the energy stored in height for the kinetic energy that would carry him into the enemy formation. Behind and right, Lipscomb matched the maneuver without radio communication. The 2 pilots had briefed standard intercept procedures before takeoff. Certain actions required no coordination. When the lead aircraft attacked, the wingman followed and engaged targets of opportunity while maintaining visual contact with his element leader. The Japanese formation continued climbing, unaware. At this range, perhaps 1,200 yards in closing, individual aircraft resolved into components. The transport's windows caught morning light. The fighter's propeller discs flickered silver against the blue-gray backdrop of mountains and sky. The formation's geometry remained intact, escorts maintaining their positions around the central aircraft with the discipline of a formation that felt secure. Shomo's gun sight tracked toward the transport. The decision emerged from a tactical logic that transcended personal survival. The transport was the mission. The fighters were protection for the mission. If the transport was destroyed, the enemy's purpose failed regardless of what happened to the American attackers. Destroying the centerpiece of a formation forced the escorts to confront a strategic failure. Their principal reason for being in the air had ceased to exist. The arithmetic of courage was not about odds. It was about objective value. 800 yards. Closing rate exceeded 600 miles per hour combined. The P-51's nose dropped further, converting the approach into a diving attack that would carry maximum energy through the engagement. Shomo's airspeed indicator climbed. 380, 390, approaching 400 miles per hour in the descent. The Mustang's controls stiffened with speed, requiring greater pressure to input corrections, but responding with the precision of a machine designed for exactly this purpose. 600 yards, still no reaction from the Japanese formation. The escorts continued their stations. The transport held its course. The entire enemy force flew into the American attack without recognition of what approached from above and behind. 400 yards. Shomo's thumb pressed the gun button. The 650 caliber Brownings erupted simultaneously, their combined rate of fire producing a sustained roar that filled the cockpit with vibration and sound. Tracer rounds, 1 in 5, drew glowing lines through the air, converging on the target in a cone of destruction that narrowed toward the transport's fuselage. The first bursts struck the twin-engine aircraft in a sequence that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Impacts walked across the fuselage, port wing root, and engine nacelle. Aluminum skin ruptured under the hammer of half-inch projectiles. Smoke began trailing almost immediately, white at first, suggesting coolant or hydraulic fluid, then darkening toward the gray-black of burning oil. The transport pilot initiated an evasive maneuver too late. The aircraft banked left, attempting to dive away from the attack, but the damage was already catastrophic. Fire appeared at the port wing root, fed by ruptured fuel lines. The wing's structural integrity began failing as heat weakened aluminum spars. Shomo pulled up and right, breaking off the attack before collision became a risk. His airspeed remained high, more than 350 miles per hour. The Mustang climbed aggressively, converting speed back into altitude, while his head swiveled to track the developing tactical situation. The transport was finished. Fire engulfed the port wing. The aircraft's bank steepened beyond control as the pilot lost authority over the burning machine. It would impact the mountains below within seconds. But the engagement had just begun. 11 fighters remained. They had witnessed the destruction of their principal. They now understood that American aircraft occupied their airspace, and they were reacting. The doctrine Shomo violated was not arbitrary. Fighter combat training emphasized numbers because numbers represented physics. A single fighter engaging multiple opponents faced geometric disadvantages that no amount of skill could fully overcome. While engaging one target, others maneuvered for position. While tracking one enemy, others disappeared from visual contact. The human eye could only focus on one point at a time. The aircraft could only turn in one direction at a time. Multiple opponents created simultaneous problems that single pilot operation could not solve. The standard response to an engagement against superior numbers was simple: attack, disengage, escape. Exploit the initial surprise, accept whatever damage could be inflicted in the first pass, then use speed and energy to exit before coordinated defense could develop. Shomo's aircraft passed through the formation's altitude band in a climbing turn. He did not exit. His head tracked continuously, absorbing the positions of enemy fighters as they responded to the attack. The formation had scattered, its cohesion broken by the shock of the transport's destruction. Some fighters dove toward the burning wreck, perhaps seeking to confirm the nature of the attack. Others climbed toward the American aircraft, seeking to establish an altitude advantage. The tactical situation was chaos, but chaos could be exploited. Shomo completed his climbing turn and reversed, diving back toward the formation from a direction the climbing Japanese fighters could not easily counter. A Ki-43 that had separated from the main group crossed his gun sight at a range of approximately 400 yards, close enough for effective fire, distant enough to allow correction if the enemy maneuvered. The Japanese pilot had not yet reacquired the American fighter. Shomo fired a burst of approximately 200 rounds. The tracer stream walked across the Ki-43's engine, cowling, and cockpit area. The fighter rolled inverted, smoke pouring from the radial engine, and began the steep descent that indicated total loss of control. Second kill. Perhaps 20 seconds since the engagement began. Behind him, Lipscomb had engaged targets independently. The wingman's firing could be heard on the radio, the squelch breaking momentarily with the electrical interference generated by gun discharge. His attacks added to the confusion, forcing Japanese pilots to track multiple threats rather than concentrating their response against a single American. A Ki-43 appeared in Shomo's peripheral vision, closing from 7 o'clock low. The human visual system detects motion before it identifies shape. Something was moving in a quadrant that represented threat. Shomo responded before conscious recognition, stick back and right, pulling the Mustang into a climbing turn that increased the angle off between his aircraft and the approaching fighter. The enemy pilot had anticipated a straight flight path. His guns fired into empty air as Shomo's turn carried the P-51 out of the firing solution. The Ki-43's superior turn rate at low speed would eventually bring it around to a second attack, but that maneuvering took time. Time was the resource Shomo exploited. He continued the turn through 360 degrees, completing a full circle while scanning for his next target. The maneuver cost altitude and airspeed. The physics of sustained turning required sacrifice of energy, but it also maintained situational awareness at a moment when orientation mattered more than position. A second Ki-43 entered his field of view, this one attempting to climb toward his altitude band from below. The geometry was not ideal. The enemy aircraft was nose-on, a difficult deflection shot that required leading the target significantly. But the alternative was allowing the enemy to complete his climb and establish an attack position. Shomo pushed the nose down, diving toward the ascending fighter. The closure rate approached, 700 miles per hour combined. The window for effective fire would last less than 2 seconds. His gun sight tracked above the enemy aircraft's nose, compensating for the lead required at this convergence angle. He fired. The burst was shorter than training doctrine recommended, perhaps 150 rounds, but the angles aligned. Tracers flashed past the Ki-43's nose, then through it, then into the engine, cowling as the relative motion carried the impact pattern across the airframe. The Japanese fighter's climb terminated in smoke and falling debris. 3 kills. Elapsed time approximately 40 seconds. But the engagement was evolving faster than any single pilot could fully track. Japanese fighters had recovered from their initial disorganization. They were forming into smaller groups, attempting to coordinate attacks against the 2 American aircraft that had shattered their formation. Shomo's fuel consumption had increased to combat rate, approximately 3 gallons per minute at full throttle, consuming reserves that could not be replaced until he reached friendly territory. His ammunition counters had dropped by approximately 500 rounds. The mathematics that had seemed impossible at the engagement's start remained impossible. But he was still flying, still fighting, still inflicting damage. The decision that no training manual taught was the decision to continue. The Japanese formation's response showed the observable patterns of disruption. Individual fighters that had formed the transport's escort now flew independent courses, their original defensive geometry dissolved by the American attack. Some climbed, some dove, some circled the area where their principal had crashed into the mountains below, as though uncertain whether continued flight served any purpose. Shomo identified this dispersion as opportunity. An organized fighter formation could concentrate fire, coordinate attacks from multiple angles, and protect individual aircraft through mutual support. A dispersed collection of fighters operating independently could be engaged piecemeal, one aircraft at a time, each encounter isolated from the others by the confusion of combat. His altitude had decreased to approximately 8,000 feet. Airspeed remained above 300 miles per hour, adequate for continued maneuvering, but below the optimal energy state for aggressive engagement. The P-51's engine remained at full military power, the Merlin running hot but within limits. Two Ki-43s appeared ahead, separated from each other by perhaps 500 yards. The lead aircraft had positioned himself for an attack run on Lipscomb, who was maneuvering independently at lower altitude. The second aircraft appeared to be following his wingman without clear tactical purpose, perhaps newly commissioned, perhaps confused, perhaps simply overwhelmed by the pace of events. Shomo attacked the trailing fighter first. His diving approach carried him into firing range before the Japanese pilot recognized the threat. A burst of approximately 175 rounds struck the fighter's wing root and fuselage. Fire appeared almost immediately, the characteristic orange-white of burning fuel that indicated a ruptured tank. The Ki-43 entered a descending spiral from which recovery was impossible. Fourth kill. Perhaps 90 seconds elapsed. The lead Japanese fighter had witnessed his wingman's destruction. His attack run on Lipscomb was abandoned. The American wingman's position no longer mattered when an immediate threat occupied his rear quarter. He broke hard left, diving toward the terrain in an attempt to escape. Shomo followed. The pursuit carried both aircraft below 6,000 feet into the altitude band where mountains became obstacles rather than backdrop. Valley walls rose on either side, channeling the chase into corridors that limited maneuvering options. The Ki-43's pilot flew aggressively, using terrain features for cover, but the P-51's speed advantage eroded his lead with every second. At a range of approximately 300 yards, Shomo fired. The burst was accurate. Hits registered across the fighter's empennage and rear fuselage. The aircraft did not immediately catch fire, but control surfaces visibly failed. The rudder deflected at an angle inconsistent with deliberate input, and the horizontal stabilizer showed damage that affected pitch authority. The Japanese pilot attempted to maintain flight. His aircraft descended toward a valley floor that offered no safe landing area. The final moments of his flight disappeared beyond a ridgeline, the outcome unclear, but the trajectory unmistakable. 5 kills confirmed or probable. 2 minutes elapsed. Shomo pulled up from the valley, climbing to regain altitude and situational awareness. His fuel state had become critical for extended combat. Consumption at combat power had reduced reserves to the point where return to friendly territory required immediate consideration. Lipscomb's aircraft appeared to port, climbing on a parallel track. The wingman had engaged targets during Shomo's maneuvering. Subsequent analysis would credit him with 3 destroyed, but his aircraft showed no visible damage. The Japanese formation's coherence had collapsed entirely. Individual fighters fled the engagement area on divergent headings. No coordinated. Resistance remained. The transport had been destroyed. The escort had suffered losses that exceeded 50% of its original strength. The mathematics that had predicted American defeat had failed to account for the compound effects of surprise, speed, and sustained aggression. Shomo broke off the engagement. His aircraft turned toward the southeast, toward friendly airspace, toward the airfield at Lingayen, where fuel and ammunition and ground crews waited. Behind him, the mountains of northern Luzon held the wreckage of a mission that would never complete. The flight home took approximately 40 minutes. During that time, the full scope of what had occurred began to resolve into a tactical after-action narrative that would reach 5th Air Force headquarters before nightfall. 1 American pilot, 7 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single engagement. His wingman had accounted for 3 more. The transport and its unknown cargo had been eliminated. The heavy escort that had protected it had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The engagement would eventually be characterized with a single phrase that captured its essential nature. He kept attacking. The Medal of Honor citation for Major William A. Shomo reads with the procedural restraint of official military documentation. It references the date, the location, the approximate engagement circumstances. It notes the numerical disparity between the 2 American aircraft and the 13-ship Japanese formation. It describes Shomo's decision to attack despite the odds and credits him with destroying 7 enemy aircraft in a single engagement, 6 fighters and 1 bomber, while his wingman accounted for 3 additional kills. The language is precise. The emotion is absent. This is the nature of official recognition. The citation exists as a record, not as a narrative. It confirms that certain actions occurred, that those actions met the criteria for the nation's highest military honor, that the individual named demonstrated extraordinary valor beyond the call of duty. What the citation cannot capture is the texture of the experience, the vibration of the airframe under sustained fire, the tunnel vision that accompanied high-G maneuvering, the sweat that accumulated in flight gloves despite the cold of altitude, the particular clarity of thought that emerged when survival became a problem measured in seconds rather than hours. Shomo never provided extensive public commentary on the engagement. After the war, he returned to Pennsylvania, to the landscapes and communities that had shaped his early life. He pursued a career in aviation that extended his connection to flight without requiring him to engage in combat. He married, raised children, participated in the ordinary rituals of post-war American life. His name appeared occasionally in retrospective accounts of Pacific air combat. Veterans organizations recognized his achievement. Aviation historians included his engagement in analyses of Mustang operations against Japanese forces, but Shomo himself remained largely silent about the specifics of what had occurred above Luzon. This silence was not unusual among Medal of Honor recipients. The men who received that recognition often struggled to reconcile the official narrative of heroism with their own internal experience of events that felt, in the moment, more like reaction than decision. The citation described courage. The pilot remembered survival. The citation described extraordinary valor. The pilot remembered the sequence of actions that kept him alive for another 5 seconds, then another. The cost of aerial combat was not primarily measured in casualties, though casualties were real and significant. The cost was measured in the accumulated stress of repeated exposure to circumstances where death was probable and prevention was uncertain. Pilots who survived these experiences carried them forward into lives that were shaped by what they had witnessed and done. Some spoke of their service freely. Others maintained the silence that Shomo largely adopted. Neither response was more valid than the other. What remained, constant, was the gap between official recognition and personal memory. The Medal of Honor citation for William A. Shomo describes an engagement that lasted approximately 2 minutes. In that time, he destroyed 7 enemy aircraft and contributed to the destruction of 3 others by his wingman. The official record characterizes this as extraordinary heroism in aerial combat. The pilot who climbed out of that P-51D Mustang at Lingayen Airfield knew only that he had survived a situation that should have killed him. He had attacked when Doctrine said to evade. He had continued when mathematics said to stop. He had pressed his advantage until advantage became overwhelming superiority, until the formation that outnumbered him ceased to exist as a fighting force. Whether this was heroism or something else, instinct, calculation, the accumulated training of years compressed into seconds of decisive action, remained a question that official language could not answer. The mountains of Luzon kept the wreckage of that January morning. The pilot who created that wreckage lived into peacetime, into a life measured by quieter achievements than the destruction of enemy aircraft. The sky above those mountains remains the same sky it was in 1945. What happened there on January 11th required 2 minutes. Understanding what it meant requires acknowledging that some questions about courage, about survival, about the mathematics of impossible decisions may not have answers that fit comfortably into citations or narratives or the neat categories through which we organize our understanding of war. William A. Shomo did not set out to become a Medal of Honor recipient on the morning of January 11, 1945. He set out to fly a reconnaissance mission and return with photographs. What he brought back instead was a story that the 5th Air Force initially struggled to believe, a story of 1 pilot against 13 aircraft of attack sustained beyond all reasonable limits, of an outcome that defied the probabilities that governed aerial combat. The official record confirms the facts. The silence that followed confirms something else: that the men who lived through such moments often found them impossible to discuss, not because the memories were painful, but because the language available to describe them was insufficient. He kept attacking. That phrase, in its simplicity, contains everything the citation says and everything it leaves unsaid. A pilot faced impossible odds and refused to accept the impossibility. The mathematics failed. The pilot survived. And somewhere in that gap between failure and survival lies the truth of what aerial courage actually meant in the skies above the Pacific.